Hi, good afternoon. Actually, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the NECAFS webinar this morning. I'd like to thank you for taking some time to join us today. I'm excited to discuss the alignment between Harmonized GAP and FSMA Produce Safety Rule. First, just to make some brief introductions for those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Newbold, and I'm the Center Administrator for NECAFS, which is the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety. And the project director, Chris Callahan, is also on the line, also from the University of Vermont. I just want to do a brief introduction of the Regional Center if you're not familiar with us. The Northeast Regional Center to Advance Food Safety is one of 4 funded regional centers to help with the outreach, education, and implementation for producers and processors who may be affected by FSMA. We have several resources I just want to quickly go over. If you're not familiar with, we have our website, and that's just a general place where you can go and sign up for our newsletter or listserv. All of our past webinars are posted on our website, and there's also all of the information about other NECAFS programming available there. We also have a clearinghouse, if you're not aware. Here's the website. There's also a link directly from our website. And this is a place where we are collecting all food safety resources that have been created. And if you're not familiar, there's some how-to videos on that resource that you can go and learn more about. In the last few months, we've also added a section where people can post TAN questions and answers that they have submitted to the FDA TAN where they've received answers. So we're collecting those there as a summary so that people can read them and learn from them and use them as a resource. And then I also just wanted to let everybody know that we have determined the dates for our next annual meeting and conference, and it will be held in Albany this time, Albany, New York, and the dates will be February 5th, 6th, and 7th of 2019. So mark your calendars for that, and there will definitely be more information coming soon as we confirm those details. So that's just a brief introduction to NECAFS and where you can go to learn more. I also just want to quickly go over some audio pieces of information. We are now using GoToWebinar, which is a little bit different than what we had been using in the past. And so if you're calling in using your phone, in order to have the capability to mute or unmute yourself, you have to enter your audio PIN when prompted. And so I'm including this graphic here. You can see that when you select to use your phone, it'll give you an audio PIN, and you have to actually enter that PIN. And then once you've entered the PIN, you can mute or unmute yourself by hitting *6. So just a little bit of housekeeping there. The other thing is that everybody is muted, and so if you are interested in asking a question, there are 2 options for you to do that. You can raise your hand, and then we can unmute you at the end of the presentation and you can ask the question, or you can actually just put your question into the question box and we will facilitate questions at the end. And so we can review that again when we get to the end of the presentation. But for now, I just wanted to thank Ken for taking the time to share with us this morning, and I will turn the presentation over to him. Let me just quickly make him presenter and he can start to share his screen. And in the meantime, just so everybody has a bit of a background, Ken is from the USDA and is taking time this morning. He's a chief at the USDA-AMS Audit Services Branch, and we appreciate him taking the time to go through this alignment and how that's come to be and how things are going since the announcement was made in June. So with that, Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, and thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the webinar today and share with you some of the news and updates that we have in regards to the USDA Good Agricultural Practices program. So, as Elizabeth said, we are going to focus today on the recent announcement of the alignment of the USDA Harmonized GAP Audit with the Produce Safety Rule. So I wanted to just take a brief moment and talk about the USDA Good Agricultural Practices Program for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with it. The Agricultural Marketing Service is an agency within USDA that has a primary mission of facilitating agricultural products in the marketplace. And USDA Good Agricultural Practices Program is one program within AMS that certainly does help facilitate marketing by providing producers with market access audits that they then can use when selling products to buyers and retailers and things like that. So when we look at the USDA Good Ag Practices Program, it was established back in 2002 upon industry request. As with a lot of AMS programs and services, they typically are industry-driven services. The USDA GAP program is a voluntary program. This is not a regulation. It is completely up to the producer or other users of our services to undergo these audits. It is 100% user fee funded, as opposed to a lot of other programs within USDA that may be covered by appropriated funds and things like that. The Agriculture Marketing Service, many of our services are user fee funded. And again, it's primarily used for market access, and it's based on FDA guidance and regulations as well as industry best practices. And we deliver our services across the United States through cooperative agreements with state departments of agriculture, where we train and license State Department of Agriculture employees to provide, in the case of the Special Crops Inspection Division, where I work, with inspection and audit services in those states around the country. And it really is a win-win for everybody, for the producer. It's a more cost-effective solution because there are people right there in the states that are providing those services to the grower, and ultimately ends up being a much more timely service because, again, those inspectors and auditors are located right in the states where they're providing the service. The staff under the Special Crop Inspection Division also does perform audits and inspections around the country, particularly in places where we either don't have cooperative agreements or one of our federal offices is closer to a particular growing region or things like that. And as you can see here, the number of audits that we performed under the GAPS program has grown quite a bit from its inception. This slide goes back to 2006, where we did 365 GAP audits. This past year, we did just over 4,300, and we are on pace here in 2018 to exceed that number again. So, these are individual audits of operations around the country. We do perform audits in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. So, you can just see that there's extreme interest in our program as the program has developed and matured over the years. So when we look at the USDA GAP program, it has evolved over time. So if we look at the individual services under the USDA GAPS program, we have the initial USDA GAP and GAP Audit, which was the original program that was developed in 2002. And then as we move forward, the Tomato Audit Protocol, which is an industry-driven initiative, was launched in 2006. In 2007, as a result of the outbreak associated with spinach, the California and Arizona Leaf Ingredient Marketing Agreement programs were established. Those are state-level programs, but they asked to partner with the USDA to provide oversight on the training and evaluation of their auditors under those programs. The Mushroom GAP program, the Harmonized GAP program, which I'll be talking here a little bit more about, the Cantaloupe program in 2012, and then our most recent newest audit program is Harmonized GAP Plus, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So when we look at the GAPS, Harmonized GAPS Initiative, this is an industry-led effort to harmonize the various food safety audits typically used in the produce industry. It was formed back in 2009, 2010, and it really had a goal to reduce the number of redundant food safety audits that producers were going through. It was not uncommon, and still isn't uncommon, for growers to have to undergo multiple audits depending on buyers' requirements. So the initiative really looked at how they could try to harmonize all these different audits that were being used and reduce the number of audits and hopefully get it down to where growers are going through one audit. Now, we haven't reached that goal yet in many cases, but we have seen where growers are reducing the number of audits that they're going through. The GAPS Harmonization Initiative ultimately created a technical working group. It was made up of over 100 industry representatives from growers, handlers, packers, trade associations, individual state, horticultural councils, different things like that. Academia, researchers, governments, all were involved in this technical working group. And over an 18-month period, went through and essentially benchmarked all of those individual food safety standards that were being used, which resulted in the creation of the Produce GAPS Harmonized Food Safety Standard, which was released in 2001. USDA was a key participant in the technical working group. I actually represented the agency on that technical working group and attended every single one of the meetings that were involved in the creation of the Harmonized Standard. And ultimately, USDA was an early adopter of the Harmonized Standard, and we actually are the largest user of the standard. This past year, we conducted over 1,300 harmonized audits across the country. As part of the GAPS Harmonization Initiative, we actually have signed an agreement with the United Fresh Produce Association, which acts as the secretariat of the Harmonized Initiative, which outlines the use of the standard. And there are some very specific requirements that we need to adhere to within the use of the Harmonized Standard within our program. And lastly, we remain active on the Calibration Committee, which is a subset of the technical working group that handles questions that may arise regarding the interpretation of the Harmonized Standard. One of my staff sits on that Calibration Committee, and they meet on a regular basis to answer questions and ensure the uniformity of the Harmonized Standard by all the different certification bodies that are using the Harmonized Standard. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act. Many of you are well aware of these points. Signed into law in 2011. It's comprised of 8 foundational rules. And ultimately, AMS committed to aligning the GAPS program to FSMA, to the industry, because of the points that the industry brought up to us. Growers were asking us, hey, we're already going through a GAPS audit. Now this FSMA thing's out here. It'd be great if we could somehow be able to use our market access audit to also show compliance to FSMA. And AMS certainly, in partnership with FDA, as we were going through the development of FSMA, and ultimately once the rules were promulgated and things like that, certainly wanted to try to help industry comply with FSMA in some way. So the alignment of our GAPS program is certainly one way we could do that. And ultimately, the produce safety rule finalized and published in November of 2015 with an effective date of January of 2016. So when we look at FSMA, some of the key rules related to the USDA GAPS program, the largest one obviously being the produce safety rule. The other rules do have some impact on our GAPS program, certainly control for human food, sanitary transport, and then most recently the food defense mitigation strategies that just recently came out. So those are all things that we ultimately looked to as we were aligning the GAPS program to FSMA. So as I alluded to, we really initiated the alignment project with FSMA at industry request, and as part of USDA and FDA's formal commitment to partner on food safety issues. There are a number of agreements between both agencies to work collaboratively on food safety issues, and this is certainly one of the ones that was front and center. We created a working group that consisted of USDA, FDA, and NASDA technical experts. And again, we went through the produce safety rule as well as the Harmonized Standard to see how they aligned and did that initial assessment. And we undertook that in 2016 to ensure that the USDA Harmonized GAP Program met at least the minimum technical requirements of the produce safety rule, with a goal to provide a tool for growers to assess compliance to the rule as part of their voluntary market access audits. Again, and FDA has been very clear on this, that an audit does not replace a regulatory inspection. However, states and FDA can use an aligned audit within their compliance strategy to determine where they will put the resources and target resources in particular commodity groups or other growers and things like that in a particular state. One thing to note is that the USDA Harmonized GAP Audit is not intended to be a FSMA audit. It is still first and foremost a market access audit, and it covers topics that are necessary for market access above and beyond what's in the produce safety rule. So as we went through and conducted that alignment, we identified the things that needed to be changed or updated within the Harmonized Standard to align with the produce safety rule. And we ultimately went back and we presented those changes to the GAPS Harmonization Initiative, because remember, as I said, the initiative controls the Harmonized Standard. And the technical working group held a meeting, went through those recommendations as well as other recommendations from other entities, but ultimately ended up adopting those recommendations and published the updated standard in January of 2017. That standard then was made available to all of the certification bodies and USDA for use. And we went back and updated our own USDA Harmonized GAP program to incorporate those changes, as well as some other updates that I'm going to get into here in a little bit. And we published the USDA version of the Harmonized GAP standard in January with an effective date of May 1st of this year, just a couple of months ago. And that ultimately, those changes that we made, working again with FDA, culminated in early June, where the Secretary of Agriculture Perdue and FDA Commissioner Gottlieb formally announced the alignment of the USDA Harmonized GAP program with FSMA. As I mentioned, it has potential for states and FDA to incorporate the results of our audits into their compliance strategies as we're looking to put their inspection resources and things like that in place within their states. So I just wanted to give just a kind of a quick example of alignment. The The requirement in the Harmonized Standard is that personnel with food safety responsibilities shall receive training sufficient to their responsibilities. And further goes on that the food safety designate has completed at least one formal food safety course, workshop by job experience, or is required by prevailing regulation. And that phrase, or is required by prevailing regulation, appears a lot in the Harmonized Standard. So as we are looking to go out and do an audit, and we're interpreting that as our auditors are out in the field, if the operation is subject to the produce safety rule, then the auditor would expect to see evidence of training that is required under the rule. So produce safety alliance or equivalent type training would be what we're looking for here. So that's a pretty simple example of how we've aligned the program. But again, it pulls in that prevailing regulation requirements. We would expect to see that in the going back and doing it. So looking at the program updates for 2018, and I want to make this very clear. No requirements changed from the 2017 version to the 2018 version of the USDA Harmonized GAP Standard. And I mentioned the Harmonized GAP Plus, which I'll get into in a little bit. That is a little caveat there, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So the actual requirements that are part of the Harmonized Standard that is published on the United Fresh Produce Association website is the Secretariat of the initiative. That 2017 version that they published, the 2018 version of USDA's Harmonized GAP Standard, same exact requirements. Wording is the same, everything is the same. So here's what has changed. As we were looking at updating our program for a number of reasons, one of the elements that we heard from our auditors as well as producers that are using the standard and things like that is that it was a little cumbersome, it was a little hard to follow, and it was a little hard to understand. So we went back through and we essentially reorganized the requirements. So what we ended up doing is combining the field operations and harvest standard with the packing house standard to create a single combined standard. We broke that combined standard down into 4 sections. There's a general questions section, which are the questions that essentially were in both the field operations harvesting as well as the packing house standard. Then there's a separate field operations section, a separate packing house section, and then a section for local use for those that are authorized to use the USDA GAP Program. And what we did is we ended up removing redundant questions. We grouped questions that were similar together, so that again, that the flow of the audit made more sense, that the questions that were closely associated with each other were grouped together, and it ultimately ended up in a better understanding of the requirements. And we've heard from numerous growers, other extension agents and things like that have said that they like what we did with the reorganization. It does improve the flow, it makes it easier to understand. So we have received a lot of positive feedback on that reorganization. The other thing we did is we updated the numbering. So the pre-2018 Harmonized GAP Audit, the numbering system just flowed through. It was 1.1, 1.2.1, 1.3.1.1, et cetera, throughout the whole thing. What we did, again, as we reorganized the questions, we essentially put a letter in front of the number. So G for general questions, F for the farm, P for packing house, and then 1.1, 2.2A, 3.1, et cetera. So the numbering system is different. The other thing that we did is we created a table showing the linkage from the old numbering system to the new numbering system, and that table is on the AMS website. That's the specific address where you can go and get that. But if you look on our main website, you'll see that numbering system. So for those that are Users of Harmonized Standard for the past couple of years and want to see how the question numbers are lined up from the 2018 version to the pre-2018. That's available for them to look at and see how the questions are. The other thing we did is we made an update to the documentation categories. Within the audit, we had a number of documentation categories. We had an R for a record, a P for a policy, that kind of thing. So what we did is we added a new category called risk assessment, and it really helps clarify when an actual risk assessment must be performed. That was one thing that, again, based on feedback from users and our auditors, that they felt would help identify when an actual risk assessment needed to be performed. So we added that to the category as well. So the other thing that we did with the 2018 version of the Harmonized Standard is we updated the USDA certification requirements. So these are the requirements that must be met in order for USDA to issue a certificate that you have met USDA's acceptance criteria for the Harmonized GAP Audit. And we updated that acceptance criteria for both the USDA Harmonized GAP and Harmonized GAP Plus audit. And again, a lot of the changes that we made are, again, based on feedback that we received from industry, we received from auditors, we received just in the normal course of business. And what we heard from stakeholders, that they told us that the old certification requirements were confusing at times and at times too subjective. They weren't really sure what they needed to do in order to be issued certification, and that some of the requirements that we had, while they could read them, they didn't really understand what they meant and how it was interpreted. So we took that into consideration, and again, to try to help improve our program and provide the end users with tools so that they know exactly what the requirements need to be for certification. We made these updates. One of the things that we did is we went in the audit standard and in the checklist, and we included a mandatory designation to help identify all requirements that must be assessed as compliant or not applicable if it's the requirements not applicable for a particular operation in order to meet the USDA acceptance criteria. So as previously, you still must achieve a minimum score of 80% on the audit. In addition to that 80%, all of the mandatory questions must be assessed as compliant or not applicable. So it is a change in that how we interpret whether or not the acceptance criteria has been met, but ultimately it's a much cleaner way for everybody to understand what the requirements are and what they need to do. And here's an example just on the audit checklist of that mandatory column. You can see it's right here, right next to the requirements, column labeled mandatory. And if there's a dot in that field, that means that question must be assessed as compliant or not applicable as appropriate in order to meet our acceptance criteria. So next steps, as we're working towards continued relationship with FDA and working with the industry and working with the marketplace on our Harmonized GAP audit for market access. We're really next steps. The alignment announcement was really kind of the first step. It was a way to demonstrate that, yes, the technical requirements of the standard align with at least the minimum requirements of the produce safety rule, but we realize that is just a first step and we've got a lot of work to do that. We're going to be working with FDA on further training. We want to ensure that our auditors that go out and perform audits understand what the requirements of the produce safety rule are. Now, we've required that all of our auditors go through the Produce Safety Alliance training. So they've gone through the same training as the growers have gone through. The next step that we're looking at is that our auditors would receive training similar to what the FDA inspectors that are going out to do the compliance inspections would go through, so that we understand how they're interpreting the different requirements. Because the last thing we ultimately want to have happen is we interpret things one way for the audit, and then the grower happens to have an FDA inspector come out for whatever reason, and the FDA inspector is interpreting it a different way and creating confusion. So we want to work closely with FDA on interpretation issues and ensure that we're interpreting things similar to how they. The other big thing that we're working on is formal guidance documents to the updated version of the Harmonized Standard. We're currently working with FDA to get somebody from the produce safety staff over at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition to come over on a short-term detail to help us write guidance documents and ensure that, again, that FDA-centric interpretation and guidance is available in what we do, so that we're again, we're aligned. And that we're on the same page in the interpretation and stuff like that. So that's something that we're working on that hopefully is going to help the industry. We're going to partner with universities to conduct a survey to identify challenges that growers are dealing with in implementing the Harmonized Standard, some of the challenges that they may have with particular sections or particular requirements. The one thing with the Harmonized Standard, it does still require, a water risk assessment and understanding your water sources and things like that. It does require, that compost is addressed and things like that, which certainly, as you're aware, that the produce safety rule has got a delay on the implementation of the water requirements and currently doesn't have anything that addresses composting. So that's an issue that may come up for growers. So we want to work with universities to conduct that survey and come up ultimately with some tools that can help producers meet and achieve the requirements of the Harmonized Standard. Conduct a lot of industry outreach, webinars like we're here today, attending growers meetings, trade association meetings, whatever we need to do for industry outreach. We're committed to doing that. We're going to be doing, similar to this webinar, we're going to be doing some webinars through USDA to reach out to growers, reach out to buyers, reach out to extension agents to talk about our program and what we're doing and cover some of these concerns so that everybody's aware of what's going on. The other piece that we're working on, and I mentioned the Harmonized GAPS Plus standard earlier. One thing that growers are increasingly needing to comply with are buyers that have a requirement that their suppliers go through an audit against one of the GFSI benchmarked audit programs. So GFSI is an international organization that's mission is to provide continuous improvement to food safety to ensure the confidence and delivery of safety to consumers worldwide. There's a number of programs that are benchmarked to GFSI, Global GAP, Premise, GFS, SQF, a number of them out there that you may be familiar with. So the industry again asked us, is there a way that USDA can be aligned with and benchmarked to GFSI? So in March of 2017, GFSI announced a pathway for governments, government-based certification programs to achieve technical equivalence to GFSI. And in January of 2018, we applied for GFSI technical equivalency using the Harmonized GAP Plus standard. And as the name implies, it's the Harmonized Standard Plus the requirements that were missing from the Harmonized Standard to fully comply with the GFSI requirements. We are in the final stages of that process. We have completed everything that we need to do, and at this point it's in GFSI's hands to finalize their report and submit our application to the board for a formal vote. So we are anticipating in the next several months to hear from GFSI on that announcement, which we would be the first government agency to go through this formal GFSI technical equivalency process. So that's exciting news. We've got the FSMA alignment announcement that happened back in early June. We're anticipating the GFSI announcement here in the next several months. So those are two big initiatives that ultimately are helping producers better market their products through our audit and meeting those buyers' requirements, as well as providing that tool to them that helps them understand where they're complying with FSMA. When we look at resources, there's any number of resources. Elizabeth talked about some of the ones that are available through NECAFS. There's others through the other regional centers and things like that. On our website, obviously the Harmonized GAP Standard checklist are available. The summary changes I talked about. We have a lot of frequently asked questions that are up there that we put up and update on a regular basis. We have a link to the On-Farm Food Safety Project, which is a pretty neat tool that I don't know how many people are aware of or take advantage of, but it's essentially, for lack of a better term, it's kind of like a TurboTax type program to help producers write their food safety plans. So if you've got a grower that's not yet written a food safety plan in order to undergo an audit, it's a great tool to help them develop that food safety plan. And again, it kind of works like TurboTax, so just ask questions, the grower answers those questions, and at the end, you can print out a pretty good food safety plan. The GAP's Harmonization Initiative website through the United Fresh Produce Association. Again, a lot of resources that are available there. They have a number of frequently asked questions and interpretation questions and answers from the calibration committee and things like that on the GAP's Harmonization Initiative website. So that's certainly another tool. Produce Safety Alliance, obviously, a lot of good information there, similar to the 4 regional centers. The repository of a lot of good information that can help producers understand what they need to do to comply with the rule, and then ultimately complying with the rule, hopefully being able to meet the requirements of the Harmonized Standard. And ultimately, that's what we've done in the last year or so in a nutshell with our USDA GAPS program, and certainly updating it to meet and align with FSMA, as well as the market access with the food safety mission. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Elizabeth and Chris. We'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken, for that really thorough presentation. I appreciate it. And we've got some questions coming into the question box, and I just wanted to remind folks, if you want to ask a question, you can either click to raise your hand on the control panel and we will unmute you, or put a question into the question box and Chris and I will facilitate those questions. So we do have a few questions, and I'll start with one that came in sort of early in the presentation. The question is, what is the correct approach to get the right interpretation of GAP Harmonized Plus standards?
So the Harmonized Plus standard is it's the Harmonized Standard plus some additional requirements that align with GFSI. So when you go through the Harmonized GAP Plus standard, if you see a question that ends in a letter, so if it's F1.1A, if it ends in a letter, that is a question that we added in specifically to align and meet the requirements that GFSI imposed. So that's one thing that you can look for to kind of differentiate between what's already in the Harmonized Standard versus what we added to meet the GFSI requirements. As far as the interpretation, again, if you've got questions, you can certainly look on the GAP Harmonization Initiative website for some of the interpretation questions that have come up. You can certainly talk to your extension agent or state food safety specialist and things like that. I know a number of states we work pretty closely with their extension folks, and they've gone through our training and things like that to better serve producers and things like that. And ultimately, while we as the audit organization can't tell you the answer to the test per se, but if you've got an interpretation question and you're not sure how to address it, you can certainly talk to your State Department of Agriculture or contact us here in the Specialty Crop Inspection Division, and we can assist you with that.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Another question that came in, just for clarification, question G4.2, personnel with food safety responsibilities have completed at least one formal food safety course or workshop by job experience or as required by prevailing regulation. Will the auditors be required to know if the grower falls under the produce safety rule to determine if they received the training that is required under the regulation? At this time, the only approved curriculum is through the Produce Safety Alliance.
Yep, so the shortest answer to that question is yes. When the auditor starts the audit, they will ask the grower, are you subject to the produce safety? And it's a simple yes/no question. If they say yes, then we're gonna, as we're going through, we'll hold them to the prevailing regulation requirement. If they're not, then we will go with whatever is in that operations food safety plan. So if it's a risk assessment, industry best practice, whatever they've put in there to comply with the requirement. Now, for producers that aren't subject to the rule, but have a buyer that says, yeah, we don't care that you're not subject to the rule, we still want you to comply with the produce safety rule, the grower then can voluntarily incorporate those requirements into the food safety plan, and that's what we'll audit. So it gets a little messy there, but the short answer is, we're just going to ask the grower, are you subject to the rule? Yes, no. If they are, we'll note that on the audit report. Grower states they're subject to the rule. As we do the audit, we'll assess those requirements to you.
Okay, and I think that actually sort of feeds into our next question. The question is regarding the 80%. GAP has points for scoring, but Harmonized is compliant based. So does that mean that you have to be in compliance with 80% of the audit criteria to pass, except for the mandatory criteria, obviously? And how do IAR come into play as far as pass-fail if they are not in the mandatory category?
Yeah, so I'll kind of answer that going backwards. So an IAR is an eminent food safety risk or immediate food safety risk, and that is assessed only if the auditor sees something that truly is, some sort of food safety risk. So you're in a packing house and there's, the plumbing line is leaking down on finished product, or they're out in the field and a worker's, defecating in a field, or some egregious condition. That would be an IAR. If somebody doesn't have a log of the temperature of the cooler, that's not an IAR. It may not be compliant. It's a CAM, but it's not an IAR. Any IARs means that you're not going to meet the acceptance criteria, because you can't have an eminent food safety risk and meet our acceptance criteria. So that kind of addresses that. As far as the current USDA GAP and GAP audit, the basic audit that we've been offering since 2002, yes, that's a points-driven system that we incorporated back in 2002. It's been tweaked a little bit since then, but it's essentially the same point system. And the Harmonization Initiative didn't develop an acceptance criteria or a scoring guideline because that was outside of the scope of what they were looking at. The initiative developed the standard. They let the marketplace determine how to determine whether or not a grower met either a certification program's requirements or a buyer's requirements. They thought that they didn't want to dictate that. So hence there's no point system to the Harmonized Standard, and we simply went with what was developed with either compliant, corrective action needed, immediate action required. I think I hit everything in that question.
Yep, thanks, Ken. So the question about some of the resources you mentioned at the end, specifically to the on-farm food safety project. The question is, does the Create a Food Safety Manual featured on the onfarmfoodsafety.org website match the changes made to the Harmonized GAP audit, or does it create a food safety manual that meets the old audit?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I would have to check with on-farm food safety to see if they've updated that or not. So that's a good question, and I will certainly track down that answer and feedback to Elizabeth that we can get out to everybody that's on the webinar and up on our website.
Great, Ken. Yeah, we can do that. We can send out an email to everybody with any unanswered questions after the webinar. The next question is, maybe I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to this, but what is happening with the Ag Water Standard, and do you know when will FDA decide how they are going to proceed?
No clue.
We'll leave that for FDA, right, to give us more information on.
Yeah, I mean, I know they're working on it, but that's a closely guarded secret that they're not ready to share at this point yet. So I don't have any insight that I can share on that.
Okay, great. Is the difference between produce safety rule and Harmonized GAP is now only the matter of interpretation, or are there other differences? If there are, would those be made available to auditors during upcoming webinar trainings for auditors?
So the Harmonized Standard does have more requirements than the produce safety. The produce safety rule is what FDA determined was the minimum requirements to ensure public health. When you look at the Harmonized Standard, because it's a market access audit, it also takes into consideration what the buying community is wanting in conjunction with the GAP Harmonization Initiative and the purpose of the Harmonized Standard. But the generally accepted requirements for all the different audit standards that ultimately were used to create the Harmonized Standard for market access do have requirements that are in some cases above what's in the produce safety. Gave several examples with water and compost. There are other requirements where FDA and the produce safety rule they don't even have consideration for some of the requirements in the Harmonized Standard because again they were put in there for market access purposes. So that's where some of the differences are. Now, in terms of FSMA and anything that FDA may do moving forward, we've committed to aligning the standard, our GAP program with FSMA. So if and when FSMA or when FDA comes out with whatever they're going to do for water quality or if down the road they do decide to come out with something for composting, or they make some change to traceability requirements, or whatever the case may be, we will then have to kind of reevaluate the Harmonized Standard to determine whether or not it meets FDA's requirements under FSMA. If it does, great. We'll certainly share that information out with our auditors and with the community, saying, here's what FDA is now requiring. If it doesn't, then yeah, we're going to have to go through the process of getting the Harmonized Standard updated so that it's in compliance with the law.
Okay, thanks. So I do have a follow-up question, Ken, to the previous question about the 80%. So the question is, so what was the 80% mentioned on the earlier slide?
So under the USDA GAP and GIP audit, the one we've been offering for a number of years, we actually started out at 70%, but in, I think 2006 we went up to 80%. So you always had to score an 80%, plus there were some other things that we determined that you had to do. You had to have a food safety plan. You couldn't have some eminent food safety risk. There were a number of different things that we had. In the Harmonized Standard, we still used the 80% in the background to determine compliance. And again, we had a series of questions that we had identified that needed to be addressed, risk assessments, different things like that. But it wasn't, with the Harmonized Standard, it wasn't as overt what the 80% was. It was, we kind of did that in the background and issued certification. So hence why we made the changes to the acceptance criteria to, again, make it very clear as to what the requirements were. When you look at the mandatory questions, it's just over half of the questions in if you did both field harvest, field operations harvest and packing house, we did all of them. Just over half of the questions are now mandatory questions. So you're looking at, I think it's 54% of them or something like that are mandatory questions. So you still need to score an 80% minimum on the total number of questions. So above and beyond the mandatory questions, we need to get the remainder of the questions minus the NA questions as compliant as well in order to get that to that 80%.
Okay, thanks. And then we do have one more question. With this alignment, do you think that growers will think that the Harmonized GAP will replace an FDA compliance inspection?
So FDA is, as I stated earlier, FDA has been very clear that an audit will not replace a regulatory inspection. If FDA determines, or the states that's working on behalf of FDA determines that they need to go out to an operation and do a regulatory inspection, they're going to go out and do that. That's the law. That's their authority. That's what they will do. What we are hearing from FDA and FDA working with states is, again, going back to that compliance strategy. So I'll use an example, and it's more a California example, but I think it illustrates it pretty well. In California, the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement program covers 98% of leafy greens growers in the state of California. So, working with our program, if those leafy green growers are going through a harmonized audits, then the state of California, knowing that they've aligned with the program, the state of California probably isn't going to send too many inspectors out to leafy greens farms on a regular basis, because they know that those producers are already covered by our audit program. Doesn't mean that they won't go out and that they maybe choose a couple of them every year to go out on, but they're not going to put potentially a lot of their inspectional resources for leafy greens. They're going to go look at some other commodities or other parts of the state where they know that there's not an audit program in place and there's no other evidence of compliance to the rule by a particular set of producers or commodities. So that's where you may see something. In the Northeast, again, it's the same scenario. The states up there are going to kind of weigh risks and where they're going to put their inspectional resources. And if they see that these 10 growers in X county in Vermont have gone through the Harmonized GAP audit, and they've got a choice of going to those farms or going to farms in another county that have not gone through an audit and don't have any type of compliance evidence, they're probably going to put their resources on those other farms and maybe not do the ones that participated in the Harmonized GAP audit.
Thanks, Ken. So we do have just a couple minutes left. If there are any last minute questions, go ahead and put them into the question box. And while we do that, I want to again thank Ken for going through this presentation and walking through all of these questions and answers with us. I think this has been a very valuable webinar today. It certainly has answered a lot of my questions. Chris Callahan, do you have anything you want to add before we wrap up this morning?
I actually had a quick question and I couldn't figure out how to submit the question, so I'll just ask it if I can. Hey, Ken, in the checklist, is there any notation that identifies where specific harmonization with the produce safety rule was considered and how it was integrated?
We don't have that as a public-facing document at this point, so no, there's nothing on the checklist that would kind of overtly pull that out. Quite honestly, a lot of the stuff already aligned. We had maybe a couple of dozen issues of interpretation that we had to go back to the calibration or to the technical working group and address. But again, because the standard was developed with market access in mind and buyer's requirements, in many cases it had already met. But we have had a number of inquiries about who make that review kind of more available, and we're looking at the best way to do that.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, it's noon on my clock. So with that, thank you again, Ken, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And we will follow up on the unanswered question. And thanks again for joining the webinar, and hope everybody has a great afternoon.